Elena Marsh ran between the wooden stalls of the Christmas fair, her breath coming out in short white clouds, her heart slamming against her ribs like it wanted to escape her chest. She had felt the eyes on her for the last 10 minutes, watching her from somewhere in the crowd, and she knew exactly who those eyes belonged to. She clutched the old leather satchel tighter against her side and pushed past a group of carolers singing near a stall of roasted chestnuts, ignoring their cheerful voices, ignoring the smell of cinnamon and warm spice that filled the cold night air. None of it mattered right now. All that mattered was getting away before he found her. She had known this trip into town was a risk. She had known it the moment she left her small rented room that morning, with the satchel hidden under her coat. But she had no choice. The letter inside that satchel was the only proof she had left, the only thing standing between her father's ruined name and the truth that had been buried for 11 years. She had traveled 2 days to reach this town, following a lead that a retired clerk had given her weeks ago, a name and an address that might finally connect the missing pieces. And she had found what she needed. Now she just had to survive long enough to use it. A hand closed around her wrist from behind, and Elena spun around with a gasp, ready to fight, ready to scream. But it was only an old woman selling paper stars, smiling and holding one out to her. Elena managed a shaky smile and shook her head, pulling free and hurrying on. Her nerves were stretched so thin that every touch felt like a blade. She glanced over her shoulder again. There, near the mulled wine stall, a tall figure in a dark coat stood perfectly still while the crowd moved around him, and even from this distance, even in the flickering light of 100 lanterns, she recognized the way he held himself. Edmund Griggs did not chase. He waited. He watched. And when he finally moved, it was already too late for whoever he was after. Elena's stomach turned to ice. She quickened her pace, weaving through families with children on their shoulders, through young couples laughing and holding cups of warm cider, through the noise and color and joy of a night that had nothing to do with her anymore. She needed to reach the edge of the fairground, where the streets grew dark and narrow, where she could disappear the way she had disappeared a dozen times before. She had done this before. She could do it again. She told herself that with every step, even as her lungs burned and her legs grew heavier, even as the cold air felt thinner than it should. She had not eaten since the morning. She had not slept properly in 3 days, not since she found the letter that confirmed everything she had suspected about the theft that destroyed her father's life. The exhaustion had been building in her like a slow poison, but she had refused to acknowledge it, refused to give it any space in her mind, because there was no room for weakness when a man like Edmund Griggs was hunting you. But the body does not care about willpower. The body has its own limits, and Elena's had almost reached its end. The fairground opened into a wider square, where a massive Christmas tree stood covered in candles and ribbons, and it was here, in the brightest and most crowded part of the fair, that her vision began to blur at the edges. She told herself it was the lantern light playing tricks, the smoke from the chestnut stalls stinging her eyes. She pressed forward, gripping the satchel so hard her knuckles turned white, and for one terrible moment she thought she saw Edmund again, closer now, cutting through the crowd with the calm, deliberate steps of a man who already believed he had won. Her knees buckled. The world tilted sideways, the golden lights of the fair smearing into long streaks across her vision, the laughter and music turning into a distant, underwater hum. She reached out for something to hold, anything, but there was nothing there, and the cobblestones rushed up toward her far too fast. She never felt herself hit the ground. A pair of strong arms caught her before her body could strike the stones, arms that moved with a speed and certainty that startled everyone standing nearby. Duke Alexander Whitmore had not planned to be at the Christmas fair that evening. He had come only because his mother insisted that a man in his position could not be seen avoiding the town's most beloved tradition for a 3rd year running, and he had agreed simply to end the conversation. He had spent the last half hour standing near the edge of the square, half listening to a merchant describe the virtues of hand-carved ornaments, his mind elsewhere, his patience thinning with every passing minute of forced cheer. Then he saw her. He saw the young woman moving through the crowd, like someone running from a fire that only she could see, her face pale even in the warm lantern light, her eyes wide with a fear that did not belong at a Christmas fair. Something about the way she moved caught his attention immediately, some instinct he could not name pulling his focus toward her, the moment she entered his sight. He watched her push through the crowd, watched her glance behind herself again and again, and he was already moving toward her, before his mind had fully decided to do so. When she collapsed, he was close enough to catch her. Her weight dropped into his arms, and for a moment, the entire noisy, glittering fairground seemed to fall silent around him. She was lighter than she should have been, far too light, and her skin was cold to the touch, despite the layers of her coat. Her face, now that he could see it clearly, was beautiful, in a quiet, unguarded way. But it was also drawn and pale, with shadows beneath her eyes, that spoke of nights without proper rest. He looked down at her, this stranger who had fallen into his arms like she had been running from something far worse than exhaustion, and felt a strange tightness form in his chest that he did not have time to examine. A small crowd began to gather, murmuring with concern. Someone calling for a doctor, someone else suggesting the nearest inn. Alexander ignored all of it. He knelt slightly, adjusting his hold so he could lift her properly, and as he did, his eyes swept briefly across the square, an old habit from years of watching for threats in rooms full of powerful men who smiled while they schemed. He noticed a tall man in a dark coat standing very still near the edge of the crowd, watching the scene with an expression that had nothing of concern in it at all. The man's eyes met Alexander's for one brief, cold second, and then he turned and melted back into the crowd, unhurried, as though nothing about the situation troubled him in the slightest. Alexander did not know why that unsettled him so deeply, but it did. He looked back down at the woman in his arms. Her fingers, even unconscious, were curled tightly around the strap of a worn leather satchel, holding it against her body, with a grip that seemed impossible for someone who had just fainted from what appeared to be simple exhaustion. He tried gently to loosen her hand from the strap, thinking perhaps to hand the satchel to one of his men for safekeeping. But even in her unconscious state, her fingers tightened further, refusing to let go. It was such a small thing, and yet it told him something important. Whatever was inside that satchel mattered to her more than her own safety. "Fetch the carriage," Alexander said to the nearest of his attendants, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man used to being obeyed instantly. "We are taking her to the estate." His aide, a steady man named Oliver, who had served the Whitmore household for over a decade, hesitated for only a moment. "Your Grace, perhaps the physician in town would be faster, and more appropriate given that we do not know this woman at all." "She is not safe here," Alexander said simply, and something in his tone closed the conversation before it could properly begin. He did not explain the man in the dark coat, did not explain the strange certainty settling into his chest that this woman had been running from real danger, and not merely her own tiredness. He simply knew it, the way he sometimes knew things in negotiations before the other party had finished speaking, and he trusted that instinct, now the same way he trusted it in business. Oliver, recognizing that particular tone in his employer's voice, did not argue further. He hurried off to arrange the carriage, while Alexander carried Elena through the parting crowd, her body limp against his chest, the satchel still locked in her grip. People whispered as he passed, wondering who the young woman was, and why the Duke himself was carrying her so carefully, as though she were made of something more fragile than ordinary flesh and bone. Alexander heard none of it. His attention had narrowed entirely to the woman in his arms, and the strange, cold feeling that someone dangerous had just watched her fall, and felt nothing but calculation. The carriage arrived within minutes, its lanterns glowing warm against the frosty night. Alexander settled Elena carefully onto the cushioned seat, propping her head against a folded blanket that Oliver produced from beneath the bench. As the carriage began to move, rolling away from the noise and light of the fair, and into the quieter streets that led toward the Whitmore estate, Alexander found himself watching her face, studying the delicate lines of her features, the slight furrow that remained even in unconsciousness between her brows, as though even her sleep offered no true peace. He noticed the fine chain around her neck, tucked mostly beneath her collar, with what looked like a small key at the end of it. He noticed the state of her boots, worn thin at the soles despite the neatness of her coat, the careful mending along one seam that suggested someone who took pride in her appearance despite very limited means. Every small detail told a story, and Alexander found himself piecing together fragments of a life he knew nothing about, curiosity building in him, with an intensity he had not felt in a very long time. "Who are you?" he murmured quietly, more to himself than to her, watching her chest rise and fall with slow, shallow breaths. "And what has you running so afraid through a Christmas fair?" The carriage rolled on through the frosty night, carrying them both toward the grand iron gates of the Whitmore estate. And neither of them could have known, in that moment, how completely their lives were about to become tangled together, nor how dangerous the truth hidden inside that worn leather satchel would prove to be for them both. Behind them, back in the square, Edmund Griggs stood in the shadow of a shuttered bakery, watching the carriage disappear into the darkness with narrowed eyes. He had followed Elena Marsh for 3 days, patient as always, certain that she would eventually make a mistake that would let him close the distance between them. He had not expected her to collapse directly into the arms of the Duke of Whitmore, of all people, the very family whose secrets she was trying to expose. It complicated things considerably, but Edmund Griggs had not survived 11 years of careful lies and quiet manipulation by panicking at complications. He simply adjusted his plans, the way he always did, and turned to walk back into the night with the unhurried confidence of a man who believed the outcome was already decided in his favor. He would find another way to reach her. He always did. And somewhere behind the tall windows of the Whitmore estate, warm light was already spilling out into the frosty garden. Waiting to welcome a stranger, neither the Duke nor his household yet understood they were bringing into the middle of a war that had been quietly burning for over a decade. Elena stirred faintly in the moving carriage, her fingers twitching against the leather satchel, her lips parting as though she wanted to speak a warning to no one at all. Alexander leaned forward slightly, watching her with a concern that surprised him in its intensity, wondering what nightmare was chasing her even now, in the safety of his own carriage, far from the crowded square where she had fallen. He did not yet know her name. He did not yet know what she carried, or who hunted her, or how deeply his own family's history was woven into the secret she guarded with such desperate strength. All he knew was that something had pulled him toward her, the instant he saw her in that crowd, some thread of fate he could not yet name, and he intended to follow it wherever it led, no matter what storms waited on the other side. The carriage passed through the iron gates of the estate just as the first heavy snow of the season began to fall, soft and silent, covering the world in a blanket of white that hid, for now, everything dangerous still moving in the darkness beyond. Elena woke to the soft crackle of a fire and the unfamiliar warmth of blankets, far richer than any she owned. For a moment, she lay perfectly still, disoriented, her mind struggling to place the high ceiling above her, the pale gold light spilling through tall curtained windows, the faint scent of beeswax candles and fresh linen. Then memory returned in a sudden sharp rush, and she sat upright, so quickly that her head spun with the effort. The satchel. Where was the satchel? Her hands searched frantically across the unfamiliar bed, before her fingers finally found the worn leather strap resting beside her on the mattress, exactly where it should be, if someone had placed it there deliberately, gently, without disturbing its contents. Relief flooded through her chest so powerfully that her eyes stung with unexpected tears. She pulled the satchel close and pressed it against her body, running her fingers over the buckle to confirm it was still fastened, still safe, still hers. Only then did she look around properly and take in the room she had woken in. It was larger than any room she had ever slept in, larger even than the entire cottage she had grown up in before everything fell apart. The walls were painted a soft shade of blue, trimmed with white molding that curled in delicate patterns near the ceiling. A fire burned steadily in a marble fireplace across the room, and near the window stood a writing desk, carved from dark wood, polished until it gleamed. Everything spoke of wealth so far beyond her own experience that for a moment she wondered if she had died and woken somewhere entirely different from the world she knew. The door opened quietly, and Elena's entire body tensed, ready to defend herself, ready to run if she needed to, though she doubted her legs would carry her very far in her current state. But it was not Edmund Griggs who entered. It was a young woman in a simple gray dress and white apron, carrying a tray with a steaming cup and a small plate of bread. "Oh, you're awake," the young woman said, her face breaking into a relieved smile. "I'm Grace. I've been checking on you every hour since they brought you in. You gave everyone quite a fright, fainting like that in the middle of the fair." Elena stared at her, still trying to process everything. "Where am I?" she managed to ask, her voice hoarse from disuse. "The Whitmore estate," Grace said, setting the tray down on a small table beside the bed. "His Grace the Duke carried you here himself last night. Wouldn't hear of taking you anywhere else, not even to the physician's house in town, though the doctor did come here to examine you this morning while you were sleeping. Said you were simply exhausted and underfed, poor thing. Nothing serious, he said. So long as you rest properly and eat something. The words settled slowly into Elena's mind. The Duke himself. She had fainted in front of a Duke, and now she was lying in his home, in his bed, surrounded by wealth that made her feel like an intruder in a world that was never meant to include her. Panic began to creep back into her chest. If word spread of where she was, if Edmund learned that she had somehow ended up under the protection of the Whitmore family, everything could unravel in ways she was not prepared to handle. I need to leave, Elena said suddenly, pushing the blankets aside, despite the weakness still trembling through her limbs. I have somewhere I need to be. I can't stay here. Grace's expression turned gently firm, the practiced patience of someone used to managing stubborn patients. Now, you just try lying back down. His Grace gave strict instructions that you weren't to leave until you'd properly recovered, and I don't fancy explaining to him why I let a half-fainted guest wander off into the snow the moment she opened her eyes. Elena hesitated, torn between the desperate need to keep moving and the undeniable truth that her body simply would not cooperate if she tried to stand right now. Her vision still swam faintly at the edges whenever she moved too quickly, and her limbs felt heavier than she could ever remember them being. Reluctantly, she allowed Grace to help her settle back against the pillows, though she kept the satchel clutched firmly in her lap the entire time. "Eat something first," Grace said kindly, nodding toward the tray. "You'll feel steadier for it. And I imagine His Grace will want to see for himself that you're truly awake and well. He's asked after you no less than 5 times already this morning, which is unusual for him, if you don't mind my saying so." Elena's stomach tightened at the mention of the Duke, though she could not entirely name the feeling behind it. Curiosity, perhaps, or wariness, or something else entirely that she did not have the energy to examine too closely just yet. She picked at the bread on the tray, forcing herself to eat, despite the anxious knot still sitting heavy in her chest. And within a few minutes, there was a knock at the door. "That will be him now," Grace said, already moving to answer it, and Elena barely had time to straighten herself against the pillows before the door opened and Alexander Whitmore stepped into the room. He was, Elena thought immediately, exactly the sort of man she had expected a duke to look like, and yet nothing like it at all. He was tall, with dark hair that fell just slightly out of its careful arrangement, and eyes the color of storm clouds that studied her with an intensity that made her feel as though he could see straight through the careful walls she had spent years building around herself. His expression was composed, almost stern, but there was something warmer beneath it, some quiet concern that softened the sharp lines of his face the moment his eyes found hers. "You're awake," he said simply, echoing Grace's earlier words, though his tone carried something far more careful, something that suggested he had genuinely worried about the outcome. "How are you feeling?" "Better," Elena said, which was only partly true. "Thank you for your kindness, Your Grace, but I really shouldn't impose any longer. I have matters that require my attention, and I've already taken up too much of your household's time." Alexander studied her for a long moment before crossing the room and taking a seat in the chair beside her bed without invitation, a gesture that felt both presumptuous and, oddly, comforting. The physician was quite clear that you needed rest and proper meals for several days, at minimum. You collapsed from exhaustion in the middle of a crowded fair. "Miss, I would be a poor host indeed if I sent you back out into the cold the very next morning." "You don't even know my name," Elena pointed out, though there was no real heat behind the words. "Then perhaps you might offer it," he said, and there was the faintest hint of a smile at the corner of his mouth, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. Elena hesitated. Giving her real name felt dangerous, felt like handing over one more piece of the careful anonymity she had built over the last several years, while she searched for the truth about her father. But something about the steady, patient way Alexander watched her made lying feel unnecessary, even foolish. He had already seen her collapse in front of half the town. A false name would do little to protect her now. "Elena," she said finally. "Elena Marsh." "Alexander," he replied, though of course she already knew that much. Everyone in the region knew the name of the Duke of Whitmore. Alexander Whitmore, though I suspect you already knew that. A faint, reluctant smile touched Elena's lips, despite herself. "The whole town knows that." "Fair enough." He leaned back slightly in the chair, his gaze drifting briefly to the satchel, still clutched in her lap. before returning to her face, though he said nothing about it directly. Not yet. May I ask what happened last night, Miss Marsh? You looked as though you were running from something. And you were, before you fainted, moving through that crowd like a woman who believed her life depended on reaching the other side of the square. Elena's chest tightened. She had not expected him to have noticed so much, had not expected a duke, distracted by whatever business brought him to the fair, to have watched her closely enough to recognize fear in the way she moved. She searched for an easy lie, something simple and forgettable, but found that the words would not come easily under the steady weight of his gaze. I was simply tired, she said instead, choosing the safest version of the truth. I hadn't eaten properly in days, and the crowd was overwhelming. That's all it was. Alexander did not look entirely convinced, but he did not push further, not yet. Instead, he nodded slowly, accepting her answer with the outward calm of a man far too experienced in negotiations to reveal his own doubts too soon. Well, whatever the cause, you are welcome to remain here until you've fully recovered. My household staff will see to anything you need, and there is no urgency for you to leave before you're ready. That's very generous, but I couldn't possibly. I insist, he said. And though his tone remained gentle, there was an unmistakable firmness beneath it, the quiet authority of a man used to having his instructions followed without argument. Consider it settled, Miss Marsh. Elena opened her mouth to protest further, but something in his expression, some genuine warmth hidden beneath the composed exterior, made the words die on her tongue. Perhaps, she thought, a few days of rest would not be the worst thing in the world. Edmund would not expect her to be hiding inside the home of a duke, of all places. In some strange way, this might even be the safest place she could be for now, provided she was careful, provided she kept her secret close, and her guard even closer. Thank you, she said finally, softer than before. I appreciate your kindness, your grace. Alexander, he corrected gently. If we're to share a roof for the time being, I'd prefer you not address me so formally every time you speak. Something in the easy warmth of that statement caught Elena off guard, loosening some of the tension that had been coiled tightly in her chest since the moment she collapsed. For the first time and longer than she could remember, she allowed herself a small breath of genuine relief. Over the following hour, Alexander remained in the room longer than either of them likely expected, the conversation drifting slowly away from questions about her collapse and into gentler territory. He asked about small, harmless things, the sort of questions that revealed a person without demanding anything too personal in return. What she thought of the estate's gardens, visible now through the frost-covered window, whether she preferred the noise and color of the Christmas fair or the quiet of a winter morning. Elena found herself answering more openly than she intended, drawn in by the unexpected ease of his company, by the way he listened as though her answers genuinely mattered to him. She learned things about him in return, small pieces offered without prompting, that he had inherited the title far younger than he ever expected to, after his father's sudden passing, that his mother, the Dowager Duchess Margaret, held strong opinions about nearly everything, particularly regarding who he ought to marry and when, that he found the endless obligations of his position exhausting in ways he rarely admitted aloud, and that the Christmas fair, which the whole town adored, felt to him mostly like one more duty to perform, rather than a source of joy. Then why go at all? Elena asked, genuinely curious. Tradition, Alexander said, with a faint, wry twist to his mouth, and apparently, fate. If I hadn't gone, I wouldn't have been there to catch you. The words settled between them, with a weight neither of them quite acknowledged aloud, though Elena felt her cheeks warm regardless, and looked away toward the window, rather than meet his eyes directly. Throughout the conversation, her hand never fully released its grip on the satchel resting in her lap, and Alexander noticed, the same way he had noticed everything else about her since the moment she fell into his arms. He did not ask about it directly, not yet, some instinct telling him that pushing too hard, too soon, would only close her off entirely. But the question lingered in the back of his mind all the same, growing more insistent with every passing hour. What was inside that bag that she guarded so fiercely, even in her sleep, even while recovering in the safety of his own home? He intended to find out. Not through force, not through demands, but slowly, patiently, the same way he approached every important negotiation in his life. Something told him that whatever Elena Marsh was hiding mattered a great deal, and that whatever had chased her through that crowded fair had not given up simply because she had disappeared behind his gates. Outside, the snow continued to fall over the quiet grounds of the Whitmore estate, blanketing the world in white, while somewhere beyond those gates, in the narrow streets of the town, Edmund Griggs sat in a rented room, with a map spread across the table before him, already working out exactly how he intended to reach the woman who had slipped through his fingers the night before. 3 days passed before Elena felt steady enough to walk the halls of the Whitmore estate without her legs trembling beneath her, and in that time, something quiet and unexpected had begun to take root inside her chest. Something she did not entirely trust, but could no longer deny. She told herself it was simply gratitude. A person could hardly be blamed for feeling warmly toward someone who had shown them such unearned kindness, but gratitude did not usually make her pulse quicken at the sound of approaching footsteps, and gratitude did not usually make her search a crowded breakfast room for one particular face, before she had even fully entered it. She found Alexander most mornings in the smaller of the estate's 2 dining rooms, a bright, sunlit space with tall windows overlooking the frost-covered gardens, and though he always had papers spread before him, ledgers and letters, and the endless business of managing an estate as large as his, he never seemed to mind when she joined him. In fact, she began to suspect he looked forward to it, the way his shoulders relaxed slightly when she entered, the way he set his pen aside more readily than his correspondence likely warranted. "You look stronger today," he said one morning, glancing up as she settled into the chair across from him, the satchel, as always, resting near her feet rather than in her lap now, a small but meaningful shift she had not fully noticed herself making. "I feel stronger," Elena admitted, accepting the cup of tea that a servant poured for her. "Your physician was right. I simply needed rest and proper meals. It's remarkable what a few days without running can do for a person." The words slipped out before she could stop it, and she saw Alexander's gaze sharpen slightly, though he said nothing immediately, choosing instead to let the comment settle rather than pounce on it. It was one of the things she had begun to notice and appreciate about him, this patience, this willingness to let her reveal things at her own pace, rather than demanding answers she was not ready to give. "Running," he repeated eventually, his tone carefully light. "From the crowd at the fair, or something else?" Elena stirred her tea slowly, considering how much to say. "Life, mostly," she said, which was not entirely a lie. "I've been moving from place to place for some time now. It becomes tiring, after a while, always looking over your shoulder." "And what is it you're looking for when you're not looking over your shoulder?" Alexander asked gently. "A woman doesn't move from place to place for years without some purpose driving her forward." The question landed closer to the truth than she was prepared for, and Elena felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the instinct to deflect, to change the subject, to protect the fragile secret she had carried for so long, that it had become as much a part of her as her own name. But something about the quiet sincerity in Alexander's expression made the usual excuses feel hollow in her mouth. "Answers," she said finally, choosing the word carefully, offering truth without the full weight of detail behind it. "I'm looking for answers about something that happened a long time ago, something that hurt someone I loved very much." Alexander did not push further, though she could see the questions gathering behind his eyes, patient and waiting. "I hope you find them," he said simply, "whatever they are." "So do I," Elena murmured, and for a moment the honesty of that exchange settled comfortably between them, unforced and real in a way that surprised her. Over the following days, their conversations continued to deepen in this careful, gradual way, each of them offering small pieces of themselves without demanding the whole picture in return. Elena learned that Alexander had once wanted to travel before his father's death forced him into responsibilities he never asked for, that he still kept a collection of maps in his study, tracing routes to places he had never been and likely never would visit now. She learned that he preferred quiet evenings by the fire to the grand, glittering parties his position required him to host, that he found more comfort in the company of his horses than in most of the nobility he was forced to entertain. In return, she offered small truths of her own, that her mother had died when she was young, leaving her father to raise her alone in a modest cottage on the edge of a small village, that her father had worked as a steward for a wealthy family many years ago, a position he had loved and taken great pride in, until everything fell apart in ways she still could not speak about openly. That she had spent the years since his death trying to understand exactly what had happened to him, chasing fragments of truth across towns and villages, never quite finding enough to complete the picture. She did not mention the name Whitmore. She did not mention that her father's disgrace had occurred at an estate not unlike this very one, decades ago, under circumstances that still made her chest ache with grief and anger whenever she allowed herself to think too deeply about them. Some instinct, some caution built from years of careful survival, kept that particular truth locked away, even from a man whose kindness had begun to feel like something rare and precious in a world that had shown her very little of either. It was on the fourth evening, as snow fell steadily outside the tall windows of the estate's grand ballroom, that something shifted between them, in a way neither could quite explain afterward. Elena had wandered into the ballroom out of simple curiosity, drawn by the soft golden light spilling from beneath its heavy doors, and found it empty save for a single lit chandelier and the faint, distant sound of music drifting from somewhere else in the house. Perhaps a servant practicing at a piano in another room. The space was breathtaking. All polished marble floors and towering mirrors reflecting the candlelight into 1,000 shimmering points, and Elena found herself moving slowly across the empty floor, imagining, just for a moment, what it might feel like to belong somewhere this grand. She did not hear Alexander enter until his voice broke the quiet. "It's rather sad, isn't it?" he said, startling her slightly. "All this space, and it sits empty most of the year, waiting for occasions that feel more like obligations than celebrations." Elena turned to find him leaning in the doorway, watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "It's beautiful," she said honestly. "I've never seen anything like it. Would you dance with me?" he asked, the question surprising them both in its suddenness, though he did not withdraw it, crossing the floor toward her instead, with a quiet confidence that made her pulse quicken despite herself. "There's no music," Elena pointed out, though she made no move to step away as he drew closer. "There's enough," he said softly, nodding toward the faint piano melody still drifting through the walls, and he offered his hand. She should have refused. She should have remembered every reason why growing close to this man, to this family, was a dangerous and foolish thing to allow, given everything she carried in that satchel, everything she had yet to tell him. But standing there in the golden light of that empty ballroom, with snow falling silently beyond the windows, and his hand extended toward her with such quiet sincerity, Elena found she could not summon the will to say no. She placed her hand in his. They moved slowly across the marble floor. No formal steps, nothing polished or practiced. Simply the gentle sway of two people who had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, found something real growing between them, in the space of only a few days. Alexander's hand rested warm and steady at her waist, and Elena found herself leaning slightly closer than propriety strictly allowed, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from him, close enough to notice the way his breath caught faintly when their eyes met. "Elena," he said quietly, her name unfamiliar and yet somehow perfect in his voice. "Yes," she whispered. He did not finish whatever he had intended to say. Instead, his gaze dropped briefly to her lips, and for one suspended moment, the entire world seemed to narrow down to the small distance still separating them, a distance that seemed to shrink with every passing second. The doors of the ballroom opened suddenly, breaking the moment entirely, as a servant entered carrying an armful of fresh candles, apologizing hurriedly for the interruption, before retreating just as quickly. Elena stepped back, her cheeks burning, her heart pounding loud enough that she was certain Alexander must be able to hear it. "I should return to my room," she said quickly, though she made no immediate move to leave. "Elena," Alexander said again, gentler this time, and when she looked up at him, she found none of the awkwardness she expected in his expression, only a quiet, steady warmth that made her chest ache in a way she did not fully understand. "I'm glad you fainted at that fair. I know that's a terrible thing to say, but I am." A soft, surprised laugh escaped her, despite everything, despite the fear still coiled beneath every moment of happiness she allowed herself to feel in this house. "That is a terrible thing to say." "I mean it all the same," he said, and the honesty in his voice settled something deep and uncertain inside her, even as another part of her mind, the careful, guarded part that had kept her alive and hidden for years, whispered a quiet warning that this happiness, however genuine, was built on a foundation she had not yet been honest enough to reveal. That night, lying awake in the grand blue room that had somehow become hers over the past few days, Elena stared up at the ceiling and allowed herself, just for a moment, to imagine a future where the truth did not matter, where Edmund Griggs did not exist, where the name Marsh carried no shadow of old scandal attached to it. But even as the fantasy formed, she knew it could not last. Somewhere beyond these walls, Edmund was still searching for her, still determined to ensure the truth she carried never saw the light of day. And every day she remained here, growing closer to a man whose family history was tangled inseparably with her own, was a day that brought the inevitable reckoning closer. She reached for the satchel resting beside her bed and held it against her chest, the worn leather familiar and grounding beneath her fingers, and made herself a quiet promise. She would tell him, soon, before the truth found its own way to the surface, the way secrets always eventually did. She only hoped that when it did, whatever they had begun building between them in this house would prove strong enough to survive it. The Dowager Duchess Margaret arrived at the estate on a gray, windswept afternoon, her carriage rolling through the gates with the kind of unhurried grandeur that announced her presence long before she ever stepped through the front doors. Elena heard the commotion from the library, where she had taken to spending her afternoons among the tall shelves of books, and felt an immediate, instinctive tension settle into her shoulders, the sort of wariness she had learned to trust over years of watching people's true intentions reveal themselves the moment they believed no one important was paying attention. She met the Duchess for the first time at dinner that evening, and it took less than 5 minutes for Elena to understand exactly how difficult the coming days were likely to be. Margaret Whitmore was a striking woman, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, with the kind of composed elegance that came from decades of navigating the complicated politics of noble society. She greeted Elena with perfect, practiced courtesy, but her eyes missed nothing, sweeping over Elena's simple dress, her modest jewelry, the careful way she held herself at a table clearly unfamiliar to her, and filing away every detail with the quiet precision of a woman building a case. "My son tells me you fainted at the Christmas fair," Margaret said, once the initial pleasantries had been exchanged, her tone perfectly pleasant, despite the pointed nature of the question. How fortunate that he happened to be nearby. Very fortunate, Elena agreed carefully. "I'm deeply grateful for his kindness, and for your household's hospitality, Your Grace." Of course. Margaret's smile did not waver, though something calculating flickered briefly behind her eyes. "And where is it you're traveling from, Miss Marsh, if you don't mind my asking? Alexander mentioned you've been moving between towns for some time now." Elena felt Alexander's gaze flicker toward her from across the table, a silent, reassuring presence, though it did little to ease the tightness gathering in her chest. "I've lived in several places over the years, Your Grace. Nothing particularly interesting to speak of." "How curious," Margaret said, setting down her fork with deliberate precision. "A young woman, with no fixed home, no family mentioned, carrying a satchel she apparently refuses to be parted from even while unconscious. Forgive my directness, Miss Marsh, but you must understand my curiosity. My son has a certain position to maintain, and mysteries surrounding the guests in his home tend to attract exactly the kind of attention neither he nor this family can afford." "Mother," Alexander said, a warning edge entering his voice. "I am merely asking questions any reasonable person would ask, Alexander," Margaret replied smoothly, though her gaze remained fixed on Elena, waiting. Elena forced herself to remain calm, to keep her expression composed, despite the panic clawing quietly at the edges of her mind. "My circumstances are simply complicated, Your Grace. I lost my father some years ago, and since then I've had no permanent home to speak of. I understand your concern, truly, but I assure you I mean no harm to your family or your household." It was not enough, and Elena knew it the moment the words left her mouth, watching the way Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly, unsatisfied by the vague explanation. But it was all Elena could offer without revealing far more than she was prepared to share at a dinner table in front of a woman who had known her for less than an hour. The rest of the meal passed in an atmosphere of carefully maintained politeness that did little to disguise the tension simmering beneath the surface, and Elena excused herself as soon as she reasonably could, retreating to the quiet of her room, with her heart still pounding from the encounter. She was not surprised, later that evening, to hear raised voices drifting faintly from somewhere else in the house, though she could not make out the words clearly enough to know exactly what was being said. She suspected, correctly, that Margaret and Alexander were discussing her, and she lay awake long into the night, wondering how much longer she could reasonably remain in this house before the questions grew too pointed to deflect, before her careful half-truths collapsed entirely under the weight of Margaret's sharp scrutiny. She learned the details of that conversation the following morning, when Alexander found her in the garden, walking slowly along the frost-covered paths despite the cold, needing the fresh air to clear her spinning thoughts. "I apologize for my mother," he said without preamble, falling into step beside her. "She means well, in her own particular way, but she has never been especially subtle about her concerns." "She's not wrong to be concerned," Elena said quietly, staring straight ahead at the frozen garden path. "She doesn't know me. She has no reason to trust a stranger who fainted into your arms and has been living under your roof ever since." "She warned me you might be hiding something," Alexander admitted, his voice carefully neutral, though Elena could hear the question hidden beneath the statement, the invitation for her to either confirm or deny it. Elena's steps slowed. She could feel the moment stretching before her. An opening. A chance to finally tell him the truth she had been carrying since the night she first collapsed into his arms. The words gathered in her throat, ready, and yet something held her back, some deep, ingrained fear, that the moment she spoke her father's name aloud in connection to the Whitmore estate, everything they had built over these past days would shatter beyond repair. "Everyone hides something," she said instead, the words coming out softer than she intended, almost an apology in themselves. "I promise you, Alexander, I mean your family no harm. When I'm ready, I'll tell you everything. I just need a little more time." Alexander studied her for a long moment, and Elena braced herself for him to push further, to demand the answers his mother clearly believed he deserved. But instead, he simply nodded slowly, something gentle and patient settling into his expression, despite the obvious uncertainty still lingering behind his eyes. "I trust you," he said simply. "I don't fully understand why, given how little I actually know about your circumstances, but I do. Take whatever time you need, Elena. I won't push you before you're ready." The trust in his voice settled heavily in Elena's chest, equal parts comfort and guilt, because she knew, even as he spoke those words, that the time for careful secrecy was rapidly running out. Somewhere beyond the estate's gates, Edmund Griggs was still searching, still patient, still certain that he would eventually find a way to reach her before she could complete what she had traveled so far, and risked so much to accomplish. And every day she remained here, safe and warm and increasingly attached to a man whose family history was tied so intimately to her own pain, was a day that brought them all closer to a reckoning she could not indefinitely postpone. That afternoon, while Alexander attended to estate business in his study, Elena found herself once again in the library, the satchel resting on the table before her, as she carefully reviewed its contents for what felt like the 100th time. The old letters, brittle with age, detailing transactions her father had supposedly falsified. The ledger pages that told a very different story, if one knew how to read between the careful numbers. And the final piece, the letter she had traveled 2 days to retrieve, written by a retired clerk who had worked alongside her father decades ago, and finally, after years of silence, agreed to put the truth in writing. The letter named names. It described, in careful, damning detail, exactly how the theft that ruined Walter Marsh's reputation had truly occurred, and exactly who had orchestrated it, and exactly why an innocent steward had been made to carry the blame for a crime committed by someone far more powerful, someone who had spent the following decade ensuring the truth remained buried. Elena had not yet allowed herself to fully process what it would mean to bring this evidence directly into the household of the very family whose past was so deeply entangled with her father's disgrace. She had come to this town seeking only the final piece of proof, never imagining she would end up living beneath the roof of the man whose own father had once employed hers, whose own family name appeared, again and again, throughout the pages she now held in trembling hands. A soft knock at the library door made her jump, and she quickly closed the satchel, tucking it beneath a stack of books, just as Grace peered inside. "His Grace is asking for you," Grace said. "Something about wanting to show you the stables before the light fades." Elena hesitated only briefly before rising, smoothing her skirts, pushing the weight of the letter and everything it meant to the back of her mind for just a little while longer. She would tell him. She had promised herself that much. But not today. Not yet. As she made her way toward the stables, unaware of the careful, patient patience with which Edmund Griggs continued his search through the town below, Elena allowed herself one more afternoon of borrowed peace, one more stretch of hours where she could simply be a woman, falling slowly, helplessly, in love with a man whose kindness felt more real than anything she had known in years. She did not yet know how little time that peace had left. Edmund Griggs had spent 11 years perfecting the art of patience, and it was that same patience, cold and methodical, that finally led him to the gates of the Whitmore estate on a bitter afternoon, while the household went about its ordinary business, unaware that danger had drawn so close. He did not approach directly. A man like Edmund never did. Instead, he positioned himself at the edge of town, at the small inn where estate deliveries were often arranged, and began asking careful, unremarkable questions of the tradesmen who came and went. A woman traveling alone, he explained. A relative he had lost touch with, last seen somewhere in the area. He described Elena carefully, watching each face for any flicker of recognition, and on the third day, he found it in the nervous eyes of a young delivery boy who mentioned, without quite meaning to, that a woman matching that description had indeed collapsed at the fair and had since been recovering at the Whitmore estate itself. Edmund's expression did not change, though something cold and satisfied settled behind his eyes. Of course, fate, it seemed, had a particular sense of humor. He returned to his rented room that evening and began to plan, carefully, the way he approached everything important in his life. He could not simply appear at the estate's gates and demand entry, not without raising exactly the kind of questions he had spent over a decade avoiding. He needed another approach, something quieter, something that would allow him to reach Elena without drawing the attention of a household with more than enough resources to make his life very difficult if they chose to. He decided, in the end, that patience remained his greatest asset. He would wait. He would watch. And when the opportunity finally presented itself, he would take it, swiftly and without hesitation, the same way he had handled every obstacle that had threatened to expose him over the years. Back at the estate, unaware of how close the danger had drawn, Elena spent her days growing steadily more entangled in a life that felt, more and more, like something she was not entitled to keep. Her conversations with Alexander deepened with each passing day, moving beyond the careful, guarded exchanges of their first meetings into something far more open, far more honest, though the largest and most important truth of all remained locked away behind her careful silence. It was Margaret who finally forced the issue into the open, though not through the direct confrontation Elena had been quietly dreading. The Dowager Duchess had continued her own quiet investigation in the days since her arrival, sending careful inquiries to acquaintances in nearby towns, asking pointed questions of the household staff about anything Elena might have mentioned regarding her past. It was through one such inquiry, a brief but telling letter from an old friend who remembered a scandal from decades ago involving a steward named Marsh and a significant sum of missing money, that Margaret finally pieced together a fragment of the truth Elena had been so carefully avoiding. She confronted her son with the information over breakfast, her voice low and urgent despite the careful neutrality of her expression. Her father was Walter Marsh, Margaret said quietly, watching Alexander's face carefully for his reaction. The steward, who was dismissed from your grandfather's estate for theft, nearly 20 years before you were even born. Did you know this, Alexander? The color drained slightly from Alexander's face as the pieces began to arrange themselves in his mind. Memories of old family stories, whispered references to a scandal from his grandfather's time that had never been discussed openly, but had lingered at the edges of family history, like a stain no one quite wanted to acknowledge. No, he said slowly, I did not know that. I suspect that is precisely why she has been so evasive about her past, Margaret said, not unkindly, though her concern remained evident in every carefully chosen word. Alexander, I do not say this to hurt you, or to condemn a young woman I barely know, but you must consider the possibility that her presence here is not entirely coincidental. If she is the daughter of a man disgraced by this very family, what reason might she have for seeking us out, beyond simple chance? Alexander sat in silence for a long moment, his mind turning over every conversation he had shared with Elena since the night she collapsed into his arms. searching for some sign of deception he might have missed, some indication that everything between them had been calculated, rather than genuine. But every memory that surfaced only reinforced what he already believed in his heart, that whatever Elena was hiding, it was not malice, and it was not deception born of cruelty. "I need to speak with her," he said finally, rising from the table with a determination that left no room for further discussion. He found Elena in the garden once again, her favorite place to retreat when her thoughts grew too heavy to bear indoors, and something in his expression as he approached told her immediately that the careful peace they had been sharing was about to come to an end. "Alexander," she said, straightening as he drew closer, reading the tension in his posture with the practiced eye of someone who had spent years learning to anticipate danger before it fully arrived. "What's happened?" "My mother tells me your father was Walter Marsh," Alexander said, watching her face carefully as he spoke, searching for confirmation or denial in whatever reaction crossed her features. "The steward who was dismissed from my grandfather's estate for theft." Elena's breath caught, the color draining from her face, as the careful secret she had guarded for so long, finally, inevitably, found its way into the open. "Alexander, is it true?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm, allowing no room for further evasion. She could have lied. She could have denied it, could have offered some explanation that might have bought her a little more time before the full truth had to be revealed. But standing there in the cold garden, watching the careful trust he had extended to her over these past days hang in the balance, Elena found she no longer had the strength to continue the deception. "Yes," she said softly. "Walter Marsh was my father." Alexander absorbed the confirmation with a long, heavy silence, his jaw tightening as he processed the full weight of what it meant. "And your presence here, was it truly an accident, or did you seek out my family deliberately?" "It started as an accident," Elena admitted, her voice trembling now with the effort of finally releasing the truth she had carried alone for so long. "I came to this town because a lead brought me here, someone who might have information about what really happened to my father all those years ago. I never intended to come anywhere near your estate. I never intended any of this to happen. Alexander, please believe that much at least." "What information?" he asked, his voice still carefully controlled, though Elena could see the effort it cost him to maintain that composure. "What is it you're looking for?" Elena hesitated only a moment longer before finally allowing the full truth to spill forward, months and years of careful secrecy finally giving way beneath the weight of everything she felt for the man standing before her. "My father did not steal anything, Alexander. He was innocent. He was blamed for a theft he never committed, and it destroyed him. It destroyed our entire family, and he died still trying to clear his name before anyone would listen. I have spent years gathering evidence to prove what really happened, and I truly believe, that the man responsible for framing him is still out there, still protecting the lie he built all those years ago." "And you believe my family is somehow connected to this?" Alexander said slowly, the implications settling heavily over both of them. "Your grandfather employed my father," Elena said. "The theft happened on your family's estate. I don't believe your family orchestrated it, Alexander. I want to be very clear about that. But the man responsible worked closely with your grandfather at the time, and I believe he has spent decades ensuring the truth never surfaced, because doing so would destroy everything he has built since." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, staring out over the frozen garden as he absorbed everything Elena had finally revealed. "Who?" he asked finally. "Who do you believe is responsible?" Elena took a steadying breath, the name settling heavy and dangerous on her tongue after years of careful silence. "Edmund Griggs." The name landed like a stone dropped into still water, and Elena watched Alexander's expression shift from careful composure into something far more troubled. "Edmund Griggs manages several of my family's financial affairs," he said slowly. "He has served this family for decades. My mother trusts him completely." "I know," Elena said quietly, "and I believe that trust is exactly what has allowed him to hide his true nature for so long." The weight of the revelation settled heavily between them, the careful peace of the past several days shattering under the force of a truth that implicated not just old family history, but a man Alexander's family currently trusted with significant power over their affairs. And somewhere beyond the estate's gates, unaware that his secret had just been spoken aloud for the first time in years, Edmund Griggs continued his patient, careful search, one step closer than either Alexander or Elena yet realized. The days that followed the revelation in the garden carried a different quality than anything Elena and Alexander had shared before. A quiet intensity, born of shared purpose rather than simple curiosity. Alexander had listened to everything Elena told him about her father, about the years of quiet investigation, about the careful trail of evidence she had gathered across so many towns, and so many difficult conversations with people reluctant to revisit old scandals. He had not doubted her, not once, and the depth of that trust settled something in Elena that she had not realized was still so unsettled. "Show me what you have," he said, on the evening after her confession, once his mother had retired for the night, and the household had grown quiet around them. "If Edmund Griggs has done what you believe he has done, I want to understand exactly how deep this goes." They sat together in his study, the fire burning low, while Elena carefully unpacked the contents of her satchel across his desk. The old letters, brittle with age, the ledger pages with their careful, damning numbers, and the final letter, the one she had traveled so far to retrieve, written by a clerk who had finally found the courage to speak the truth after decades of guilty silence. Alexander read each document slowly, his expression growing darker with every page, the full scope of Edmund's deception unfolding before him in careful, undeniable detail. The ledgers showed discrepancies that Walter Marsh had never had the authority or opportunity to create, discrepancies that traced back, instead, to accounts Edmund alone controlled. The clerk's letter described, in plain and damning language, how Edmund had altered records after the fact, how he had ensured that suspicion fell entirely on the steward, while he himself walked away with both the stolen funds and an unblemished reputation that had only grown more powerful in the years since. "This is extraordinary," Alexander said quietly, setting the final letter down with careful hands, as though the paper itself carried the weight of everything it revealed. "Elena, this is more than enough to clear your father's name. This is enough to see Edmund Griggs held accountable for what he did." Relief and grief mixed together in Elena's chest, the culmination of years of searching finally within reach, tangled painfully with the knowledge that her father had not lived to see this moment, had died still believing the world would never know the truth. "I only wish he had lived to see it," she said softly. Alexander reached across the desk and took her hand gently in his, the gesture simple but profoundly comforting. "He would be proud of you, Elena. Whatever else happens now, know that. The strength it took to carry this for so long, to keep searching, even when the truth seemed impossible to reach. That is no small thing." The warmth of his hand around hers, the quiet sincerity in his voice, drew Elena's gaze up to meet his. And for a moment, the careful distance they had maintained since her confession dissolved entirely. He rose from his chair and moved around the desk, drawing her gently to her feet, and this time, when his gaze dropped to her lips, there was no servant to interrupt them, no sudden intrusion to break the moment before it could fully form. He kissed her softly, carefully, as though she were something precious he was afraid of handling too roughly, and Elena felt every careful wall she had built over years of guarded solitude begin, finally, to crumble. She kissed him back, her hands rising to rest against his chest, and for a long moment, the danger waiting beyond the estate's walls, the careful reckoning still to come, faded into something distant and unimportant compared to the warmth blooming steadily in her chest. When they finally parted, Alexander rested his forehead gently against hers, his breath still slightly unsteady. "I should have done that days ago," he murmured. "I'm glad you waited," Elena said softly, though a small, teasing smile tugged at her lips, despite the weight of everything else pressing down on them both. "It gave me time to fall in love with you properly first." The words slipped out before she fully considered them, and she felt her cheeks warm immediately, though Alexander's answering smile, wide and genuine, in a way she had rarely seen from him, told her the confession had landed exactly where she hoped it would. "I love you too," he said simply, the words carrying none of the careful hesitation that had marked so much of their early conversations. "I think I have since the moment I saw you moving through that crowd, though I didn't understand it then." They remained in the study long into the night, discussing carefully what steps needed to be taken next, how best to bring the evidence forward in a way that would ensure Edmund could not simply destroy or deny it before proper authorities could intervene. Alexander suggested reaching out to a trusted friend, a magistrate in a neighboring county, who owed the Whitmore family a debt of loyalty and could be relied upon to handle the matter with appropriate discretion and seriousness. Elena, for the first time in years, allowed herself to believe that justice for her father might finally be within reach. But even as they made their careful plans, neither of them yet realized how close Edmund Griggs had already drawn, nor how quickly he would act once he learned that his carefully buried secret had resurfaced, this time in the hands of a woman, protected by the very family whose trust he had spent decades exploiting. It happened the following afternoon, quietly and without warning, the way most dangerous things tend to arrive. A letter came to the estate, addressed to the Dowager Duchess, ostensibly regarding routine financial matters that required her attention, and it was Margaret herself, still troubled by the revelations her son had shared with her the previous evening, who mentioned casually over lunch that Edmund Griggs had requested a meeting at the estate the following day to discuss certain irregularities he claimed to have discovered in the household accounts. Elena felt the blood drain from her face at the mention of his name spoken so casually across the lunch table, and Alexander's hand found hers beneath the tablecloth, steady and reassuring, though his own expression had grown carefully guarded. "Cancel the meeting," Alexander said to his mother, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Or better yet, allow it to proceed, but ensure the magistrate is present as well." Margaret's sharp eyes moved between her son and Elena, understanding beginning to dawn behind her careful composure. "What exactly is happening here, Alexander?" "I'll explain everything," Alexander promised. "But you must trust me, Mother. Edmund Griggs is not the man you believe him to be." Elena sat quietly through the remainder of the exchange, her heart pounding with a familiar, dangerous fear, the same fear that had chased her through the Christmas fair only days before. Edmund knew where she was. He had likely known for some time, patient as always, waiting for the right moment to act. And now, with the truth finally spoken aloud within these walls, that moment had clearly arrived far sooner than any of them were prepared for. That night, unable to sleep, Elena stood at her window staring out over the frozen grounds of the estate, watching the moonlight glint off the fresh snow, and felt, for the first time since arriving at the Whitmore estate, that the fragile peace she had found here was about to be tested in ways none of them could fully predict. She did not yet know how right that fear would prove to be. The morning of the meeting arrived cold and clear, the kind of bright winter day that seemed entirely at odds with the tension gripping the Whitmore estate. Alexander had sent word to the magistrate, a steady, serious man named Henry Colton, requesting his presence at the estate, under the careful pretense of routine business, though the letter Alexander included privately made clear the true and urgent nature of the situation. Colton arrived early, well before Edmund was expected, and spent nearly an hour in the study reviewing the evidence Elena had carried for so long across so many difficult miles. "This is compelling," Colton said finally, setting the last of the documents down with a grave expression. "More than compelling, actually. If these records are authentic, and I have no immediate reason to doubt them, this would constitute serious grounds for a formal investigation into Mr. Griggs's conduct, both regarding the original theft and his management of your family's affairs in the years since." "They're authentic," Elena said firmly, her voice steadier than she felt. "I've spent years confirming every detail." Colton nodded slowly, his gaze moving between Elena and Alexander with quiet respect. "Then I suggest we allow this meeting to proceed as planned, and I will remain present throughout, ostensibly reviewing unrelated matters, until the appropriate moment arrives to address this directly." The plan felt solid, methodical, exactly the sort of careful approach that had allowed Elena to survive so many close encounters with danger over the years. And yet, as the hour of the meeting approached, she found her hands trembling, despite every effort to remain calm, the weight of finally confronting the man who had destroyed her father settling heavily over her entire body. Edmund Griggs arrived precisely on time, his composure as unshakable as ever, his dark coat immaculate, his expression carrying the same calm, calculating confidence Elena remembered from the night at the fair. If he noticed Elena's presence in the room when he entered, seated quietly near the window with the satchel resting beside her chair, He gave no outward indication of surprise. "Your Grace," he said smoothly, bowing slightly toward Alexander before turning his attention toward Margaret. "Your Grace, thank you for accommodating this meeting on such short notice." "Of course, Edmund," Margaret said, her voice carefully neutral, though Elena could see the tension coiled beneath her composed exterior. The meeting began with careful, unremarkable discussion of household finances, Edmund presenting a series of documents regarding recent expenditures with his usual precise, confident manner. Elena watched him closely throughout, studying the man who had haunted her nightmares for years, searching for some crack in his composure, some flicker of the monster she knew, hid beneath that polished exterior. But Edmund gave nothing away, moving through the meeting with the same unbothered calm he had displayed while watching her collapse at the Christmas fair, as though the events unfolding around him carried no real weight or consequence. It was Alexander who finally shifted the conversation toward the true purpose of the gathering, his voice carefully measured despite the obvious tension beneath it. "Edmund, before we conclude, there is another matter I believe requires your attention. Miss Marsh has brought forward some rather concerning evidence regarding the circumstances surrounding her father's dismissal from my grandfather's estate nearly 2 decades ago." For the briefest moment, something flickered behind Edmund's eyes. A flash of genuine surprise quickly smoothed back into careful composure. "I'm afraid I don't follow, Your Grace. That matter was resolved decades ago." "Was it?" Alexander asked, his voice hardening slightly. "Because the evidence Miss Marsh has gathered suggests a rather different conclusion than the one officially recorded at the time." The burrito was cold. Edmund's gaze finally shifted toward Elena, and she felt the full weight of his attention settle over her like something cold and suffocating, though she forced herself to meet his eyes steadily, refusing to allow the old fear to show on her face. "Miss Marsh," he said slowly, his tone carrying a dangerous edge beneath its surface courtesy, "how persistent you've proven to be. I had rather hoped our paths would not cross again quite so directly." "Then you admit you recognize her," Colton said calmly from his seat near the desk, and Edmund's composure faltered for the first time, his eyes narrowing as he took in the magistrate's presence with belated understanding. "This is a private family matter," Edmund said, his voice sharpening despite his obvious effort to maintain control. "I fail to see why a magistrate's involvement is necessary." "It is necessary," Elena said, finally speaking directly to him for the first time since he entered the room, her voice steady, despite the trembling in her hands, which she kept carefully hidden beneath the desk. "Because you framed my father for a theft you committed, and you allowed him to die still trying to clear a name you stole from him." The room fell silent, the weight of the accusation hanging heavily in the air. Edmund's composure, so carefully maintained for over a decade, finally began to crack, something cold and dangerous surfacing behind his eyes as he realized exactly how thoroughly his careful lies had unraveled. "You have no proof of any such thing," he said, though the confidence in his voice had grown noticeably thinner. Elena rose from her chair and reached for the satchel, drawing out the documents carefully and laying them across the desk before him, one by one, the ledger pages, the old correspondence, and finally the clerk's letter, its contents plain and damning. "I have every proof I need," she said. "And so does the magistrate, who has already reviewed everything thoroughly this morning." Edmund's eyes moved rapidly across the documents, his mind clearly racing through every possible explanation, every possible avenue of denial, and finding none of them sufficient against the weight of what lay before him. For a long, tense moment, no one in the room spoke, the only sound the faint crackle of the fire and the distant call of a bird somewhere beyond the frosted windows. Then, without warning, Edmund moved. He swept the documents from the desk in a sudden, violent motion, sending papers scattering across the floor, and lunged toward the door before anyone could fully react. Alexander moved instantly, catching Edmund's arm before he could reach the exit, and for a brief, chaotic moment, the two men struggled, Edmund's careful composure entirely abandoned in favor of desperate, animal panic. "Let go of me," Edmund snarled, twisting hard against Alexander's grip. But Colton had already risen from his seat, moving quickly to assist, and between the two of them, Edmund found himself restrained, his desperate bid for escape ending almost as quickly as it began. "It's over, Edmund," Alexander said, breathing hard from the brief struggle, his voice carrying a cold finality that left no room for further argument. "The evidence is more than sufficient. and Mr. Colton has already witnessed your reaction to it. There is nowhere left for you to run." Edmund's shoulders slumped slightly, the fight draining out of him, as the full reality of his situation finally settled in. He looked toward Elena one last time, something bitter and resigned crossing his features. "Your father was a fool," he said quietly. "He never should have questioned the numbers in the first place." "My father was honest," Elena said, her voice steady, despite the tears finally gathering in her eyes, tears of grief and relief and years of exhausting struggle, finally reaching their end. "That is precisely why you feared him." Colton stepped forward, his expression grave but composed. "Edmund Griggs, given the evidence presented and your own actions here today, I am placing you under formal arrest, pending a full investigation into these matters. You will be held accountable for what you have done." As Colton and Alexander's household staff moved to escort Edmund from the room, Elena remained standing near the desk, staring down at the scattered documents that represented years of her life, years of searching and grief, and quiet, patient determination. Alexander crossed the room to her side, gently taking her hand, as the door closed behind Edmund's departing figure, and for the first time in longer than she could properly remember, Elena felt the crushing weight she had carried for so long finally begin to lift. "It's done," she whispered, almost unable to believe it. "It's actually done." "It's done," Alexander confirmed softly, drawing her carefully into his arms. "And you did it, Elena. You found the truth, and you brought it home." Margaret, who had watched the entire confrontation unfold in stunned silence, finally rose from her seat and crossed the room toward them, her earlier suspicion replaced now with something far gentler. "Miss Marsh," she said quietly, "I owe you an apology. I judged you unfairly, and I am deeply sorry for the pain that judgment likely added to circumstances already so difficult." "Thank you, Your Grace," Elena said, her voice still unsteady with emotion. "Truly." Outside, the winter sun continued its slow climb across the clear sky, indifferent to the storm that had just passed within the walls of the Whitmore estate, and for the first time since her father's death, Elena allowed herself to imagine a future built not on running and hiding, but on truth, finally spoken aloud, and finally believed. The relief that settled over the Whitmore estate in the hours following Edmund's arrest proved, unfortunately, to be far shorter-lived than anyone had reason to expect. Colton had arranged for Edmund to be transported to the county holding house that same evening, accompanied by two of his own trusted men, along with a member of the Whitmore household staff. A sensible precaution, given the seriousness of the charges now facing him. No one anticipated that a man so thoroughly cornered, so completely stripped of the careful reputation he had spent decades building, might still find one final, desperate opportunity to strike back before his world collapsed entirely. The carriage carrying Edmund never reached its destination. Word reached the estate just after midnight, delivered by a breathless rider who had raced through the dark, snow-covered roads to bring the news. The carriage had been found abandoned along a stretch of forest road several miles from town, one of Colton's men injured but alive, the Whitmore staff member missing entirely, and Edmund Griggs nowhere to be found. Somewhere along that quiet, isolated stretch of road, Edmund had managed to overpower his captors and disappear into the darkness of the surrounding woods. Alexander received the news, standing in the entrance hall of his own home, his face draining of color as the full implications settled over him. If Edmund had escaped, if he was now somewhere out there in the darkness with nothing left to lose, then the danger to Elena, the woman whose testimony had destroyed everything he built, had not ended at all. It had simply entered a far more desperate and unpredictable phase. "Where is Elena?" Alexander asked immediately, already moving toward the stairs. "In her room, Your Grace, I believe," Oliver said, though something in his tone made Alexander's chest tighten with sudden sharp alarm. They found her room empty. The window stood slightly ajar, cold night air spilling into the space, and on the floor near the bed lay the satchel, its contents scattered across the carpet as though it had been dropped in haste or torn away by force. Alexander's blood turned to ice as he took in the scene, every careful, composed part of himself giving way to raw, desperate fear. "Search the grounds," he ordered, his voice sharp, with an urgency none of the staff had ever heard from him before. "Every inch of it." Now, The search revealed nothing beyond a set of footprints in the fresh snow beneath Elena's window, leading away from the house toward the tree line at the edge of the estate's grounds. Two distinct sets of tracks, one clearly struggling against the other. Alexander's stomach turned as the truth settled over him with brutal clarity. Edmund had come here, directly onto his own family's grounds, and had taken Elena with him into the darkness beyond. "Ready the horses," Alexander said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "All of them. I want every able man on this estate searching those woods within the next 10 minutes. Margaret appeared in the doorway, her earlier composure entirely abandoned, her face pale with genuine fear. "Alexander, you cannot go charging into those woods alone in the dark. It's exactly what a desperate man would want, drawing you out where he holds every advantage." "I am not leaving her out there, Mother," Alexander said, his voice breaking slightly despite his best efforts to maintain control. "Whatever advantage Edmund believes he holds, I promise you it means nothing compared to what I am prepared to do to bring her home safely." Deep in the frozen woods beyond the estate, Elena struggled against the rope, binding her wrists, her mind racing through every possible option, even as fear threatened to overwhelm her careful thinking. Edmund had appeared at her window with a speed and violence she had not anticipated, even after years of anticipating exactly this kind of danger, dragging her from the room before she could properly call for help, forcing her through the darkness with a cold, controlled anger that frightened her more than any outburst could have. "You've ruined everything," Edmund said now, pacing before the small fire he had built in a clearing, deep within the trees, his composed mask entirely gone, replaced by something raw and dangerous. "Everything I built, gone, because you couldn't simply let the past remain buried where it belonged." "You destroyed my father's life," Elena said, forcing steadiness into her voice, despite the fear coursing through her. "You let him die, believing the world would never know the truth. I could not simply let that remain buried, Edmund. Not while I still had breath to fight it. And now you'll die out here in these woods for your trouble," Edmund said coldly, though something in his voice suggested even he had not fully decided how far he was prepared to go. The desperation of a cornered man colliding with whatever remained of his careful, calculating nature. Elena's mind raced. She thought of Alexander, of the warmth in his eyes when he looked at her, of the promise they had made to each other only days before in the quiet of his study. She was not ready to let that future slip away, not after everything it had taken to reach this point. She began, carefully, quietly, working at the rope, binding her wrists, using the rough bark of the tree behind her to fray the fibers bit by bit, while Edmund remained absorbed in his own furious, panicked thoughts. Back at the estate, Alexander led a search party of 12 mounted men into the dark forest, lanterns bobbing through the trees like scattered stars, their combined voices calling Elena's name into the cold, silent night. Alexander's heart pounded with a fear more intense than anything he had experienced in his entire carefully ordered life, every second stretching unbearably as they pushed deeper into the woods, following the faint trail of disturbed snow that grew harder to track the further they traveled. It was Oliver, sharp-eyed despite the darkness, who first spotted the faint glow of firelight flickering through the trees ahead. "Your Grace," he called softly, drawing Alexander's attention toward the light. "There. I believe that's them." Alexander's pulse surged as he signaled the men forward, moving as quietly and quickly as the terrain allowed, every instinct in him screaming to reach Elena, before Edmund's desperation turned into something far worse than mere threats. Elena felt the last fibers of the rope give way, just as she heard the faint, distant sound of voices calling her name somewhere through the trees, and hope surged through her chest, with such force that she nearly gasped aloud. Edmund heard it too, his head snapping toward the sound, his expression shifting rapidly from fury into something closer to desperate panic, as he realized his time had run out far sooner than he expected. "They've found us," he muttered, backing away from the fire, his eyes darting toward the darkness beyond the clearing, as though searching for some escape route that no longer existed. Elena moved quickly, her freed hands trembling as she scrambled to put distance between herself and Edmund, her mind focused entirely on reaching the searchers before he could decide on some final, desperate action. But Edmund, cornered and with nothing left to lose, lunged toward her instead, catching her arm in a grip far stronger than she expected. from a man whose composed exterior had always suggested careful restraint, rather than raw physical force. "You're not leaving this clearing," he snarled, dragging her back toward him despite her struggling. "Elena!" Alexander's voice cut through the darkness like a blade, and Elena's heart leapt at the sound of it, close now, closer than she dared hope. She twisted hard against Edmund's grip, driving her elbow back into his side with every ounce of strength her fear provided, and the sudden, sharp pain was enough to loosen his hold, just as Alexander burst into the clearing, his lanterns and his men flooding the small space with light and sudden, overwhelming presence. Edmund released her entirely, stumbling backward, his eyes wide with the realization that he was now surrounded, hopelessly outnumbered, every careful plan he might have still harbored collapsing in an instant. Elena ran, closing the distance between herself and Alexander in a matter of seconds, and he caught her against his chest, with a force that spoke of every ounce of fear he had carried through those dark, endless woods. "You're safe," he murmured against her hair, his voice rough with emotion he made no effort to hide. "You're safe, Elena. I have you. I'm safe," she confirmed, her own voice breaking as the adrenaline that had carried her through the last terrifying hour finally began to drain away, leaving trembling exhaustion in its place. Behind them, Edmund made one final, futile attempt to flee into the darkness, but Colton's men, who had followed the search party into the woods once word of the escape reached the county holding house, moved quickly to intercept him, their numbers and preparation leaving him nowhere left to run. Within minutes, Edmund Griggs stood restrained once again, this time with far greater care taken to ensure no further opportunity for escape presented itself, his face pale and defeated in the flickering lantern light. "It's over," Alexander said quietly, watching as the men led Edmund away through the trees. "Truly over this time, Elena, I promise you." Elena allowed herself to lean fully into his embrace, the last of her strength finally giving way now that the immediate danger had passed. "I was so afraid," she admitted softly. "Not for myself. Not entirely. I was afraid I would never see you again. That everything we had only just begun to build would end before it truly had a chance to grow. Nothing could have kept me from finding you," Alexander said firmly, drawing back just enough to meet her eyes in the lantern light, his expression fierce, with a conviction that left no room for doubt. "I would have searched every forest in this county and beyond, Elena. There was never a version of tonight where I stopped looking until I found you." The ride back to the estate passed in a blur for Elena, exhaustion and relief tangling together so completely that she barely registered the journey, held securely before Alexander on his horse, his arms steady around her the entire way. By the time they reached the warm, lit windows of the estate, dawn had begun to break faintly over the horizon, painting the snow-covered grounds in soft shades of pink and gold, and Elena felt, for the first time in longer than she could properly remember, that the long, exhausting chapter of running and hiding had truly, finally reached its end. Margaret met them at the door, her earlier composure entirely abandoned in favor of open, visible relief as she embraced Elena without hesitation, a gesture that would have seemed impossible only a week before. "Thank goodness," she murmured. "Thank goodness you're safe." The following days passed in a strange, quiet aftermath, the household slowly settling back into its ordinary rhythms, even as news of Edmund's crimes began to spread through the county, carried by Colton's careful, thorough investigation into the full extent of the deception that had lasted more than a decade. Statements were taken, records were examined, and slowly, methodically, the truth that Elena had fought so hard to uncover began to take its proper place in the official record, replacing the old, false story that had haunted her family's name for nearly 20 years. Elena spent much of that time simply resting, allowing herself, for the first time in years, the luxury of not looking constantly over her shoulder, of not calculating escape routes and contingencies with every step she took. Alexander remained close throughout, his presence a steady, comforting constant through the exhausting process of finally closing the chapter that had defined so much of her adult life. It was Colton who delivered the final piece of news nearly 2 weeks later, arriving at the estate with a formal document bearing the seal of the county court, its contents exactly what Elena had spent years fighting to achieve. "The court has formally cleared your father's name, Miss Marsh," Colton said, his expression carrying genuine warmth as he handed her the document. "Walter Marsh is recognized, officially and permanently, as an innocent man wrongly accused. Edmund Griggs has confessed fully to the original theft and the subsequent years of deception, in exchange for what leniency the court is willing to offer given his cooperation. He will not walk free again for a great many years. Elena's hands trembled as she accepted the document, her eyes filling with tears as she read the careful, official language that finally, after so many years of struggle, restored her father's honor. "Thank you," she whispered, unable to find any words adequate to the moment. "Thank you, truly." That evening, as the household gathered for a quiet dinner to mark the occasion, Alexander rose from his seat and lifted his glass toward Elena, his expression warm with a pride and admiration he made no effort to conceal. "To Elena Marsh," he said, "who carried the truth further than anyone believed possible, and who never once gave up on the people she loved, even when the whole world seemed determined to make her forget them." The table rose in quiet agreement, and Elena felt, for the first time in her entire adult life, the full and complete weight of belonging somewhere, finally, without fear. Nearly a year had passed since the night Elena first collapsed at the Christmas fair, and as the season turned once again toward winter, the town began preparing for the very same celebration that had changed the course of her life so completely. This time, however, Elena approached the fairgrounds not as a woman running from danger, but as someone walking toward a future she had once believed entirely out of reach. The town square looked much as it always did during the holiday season. Strings of lantern lights stretched between the stalls, the air rich with the scent of roasted chestnuts and warm spiced cider. Carolers gathered near the great tree, singing songs that filled the cold evening with warmth and joy. But everything felt different to Elena now, lighter somehow, unburdened by the constant vigilance that had shaped so much of her life before that fateful night. She wore, that evening, a deep green dress that Grace had helped her select earlier in the day, along with a warm wool coat trimmed in soft fur, gifts from a household that had long since stopped feeling like a temporary refuge and had become, instead, something closer to a true home. Margaret walked beside her through the fair, the two women having grown genuinely close in the months since Edmund's arrest, their earlier tension replaced entirely by a warm, easy affection that neither could have predicted a year before. "You look radiant tonight," Margaret said warmly, squeezing Elena's arm gently as they moved through the crowd. "Alexander will hardly know what to do with himself." Elena laughed softly, though a familiar flutter of nervous anticipation stirred in her chest, one that had nothing to do with danger, and everything to do with the quiet promise Alexander had made to her only days before, hinting that he had something important planned for this particular evening, at this particular fair, though he had refused to reveal any further details despite her gentle prodding. She found him near the same section of the square where she had collapsed a year earlier, standing beneath the glow of the same lanterns, his expression carrying a warmth and openness that had grown steadily more visible over the months since Edmund's crimes had finally been laid bare. Walter Marsh's name, restored fully to honor, had been formally acknowledged by the county records months before, and a small memorial plaque now rested at the edge of the old estate grounds, where he had once served so faithfully, a quiet but permanent testament to the truth Elena had fought so hard to uncover. "You found me again," Elena said softly, as she approached him, echoing, though neither of them said it aloud, the very first moment their lives had become entangled in this same square. "I intend to keep finding you," Alexander said, his eyes warm despite the cold winter air surrounding them both. "For as long as you'll let me." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small velvet box, and Elena felt her breath catch as understanding settled over her, the noise and color of the fair around them fading into something distant and unimportant compared to the moment unfolding before her. "Elena Marsh," Alexander said, dropping to one knee despite the gathering attention of nearby fairgoers, his voice steady, despite the obvious emotion behind it. "A year ago, you fell into my arms at this very spot, and I have spent every day since falling more completely in love with you. You carried more strength and courage through your darkest years than most people carry in an entire lifetime, and you did it all while somehow still finding room in your heart for me. I do not want to spend another Christmas fair without you at my side, not this year, not any year that follows. Will you marry me?" Tears gathered freely in Elena's eyes as she looked down at him, at the man who had caught her when she fell, who had trusted her when trust seemed impossible to justify, who had ridden into a dark and dangerous forest without hesitation the moment her safety was threatened. The crowd around them had gone quiet, watching with soft, hopeful anticipation. But Elena barely noticed any of it, her entire attention fixed on the man kneeling before her in the golden lantern light. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking with joy. "Yes, Alexander, of course, yes." The crowd erupted into warm applause as Alexander rose and slid the ring gently onto her finger, before drawing her into an embrace that lifted her briefly off her feet, both of them laughing through their tears as the carolers nearby, sensing the moment, shifted seamlessly into a joyful, familiar tune that seemed to echo across the entire square. Margaret approached moments later, her own eyes bright with unshed tears, embracing Elena warmly the moment Alexander finally released her. "Welcome to the family, truly and properly," she said, her earlier suspicion from that first difficult dinner, now nothing more than a distant, faded memory. "I could not have chosen a more remarkable woman for my son, even if I had searched the entire kingdom myself." As the evening continued around them, the fair glittering with light and music and the particular warmth of a community celebrating together, Elena found herself standing quietly at Alexander's side, watching the same crowded square where her life had changed so completely a year before. She thought of her father, of the years of grief and quiet, exhausting determination that had led her here, and felt certain, in a way she had never quite managed before, that he would be proud of the life she had finally built, proud of the truth she had carried home, and proud, most of all, of the love she had allowed herself to find along the way. "Ready to go home?" Alexander asked softly, his hand warm and steady in hers. Elena looked around one final time at the fair, at the lanterns and the snow, and the joyful noise of a town celebrating the season together, and smiled, a smile free of fear, for the first time in longer than she could remember. "Yes," she said, "I'm ready." Together, they walked back through the crowded square toward the carriage, waiting at its edge, leaving behind the place where their story had first begun, and stepping forward, hand in hand, into everything still waiting for them ahead. The snow fell softly around them as they went, gentle and quiet, blanketing the town in white, the same peaceful winter magic that had once brought them together, now settling softly over the beginning of everything still to come.